All right. Hello, Western Conservative Summit. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jesse Mallory. I'm the State Director for Americans for Prosperity Colorado. And joining me today is the President of Americans for Prosperity, Tim Phillips. Tim, thanks for taking time with us.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone.
And for those of you who don't know, Tim does a lot of traveling. He's out there. He's on the Hill. He's talking to senators. He's in states. So he's got a lot of on the ground knowledge of what's going on at any given moment on Capitol Hill. So he's going to give us a great insider's view today. One thing, the biggest focus of our conversation today is going to be talking about what are we doing to end Washington waste, and I know that's a big task because there's a lot of it there. But Tim, would you walk us through what's going on? We heard that Washington just passed a near $2 trillion spending bill, and now suddenly they're talking about four more. And what's happening there? What are you hearing?
The first way to stop Washington waste is to stop this big spending bill. There's two of them, actually, that sadly this administration and Speaker Pelosi are driving hard on right now. It's a tax and spend bill for $2.3 trillion. And I'm going to put air quotes, it's the infrastructure bill.
Yeah.
We know it's not about that. It's of the most extreme partisan grab bag wish list from the left in many years to be pushed through. And it's a big fight. And I think we have a shot to do this if we unite as a movement and genuinely put the pressure on these Democrat House members, especially in swing districts across this country. They're going too extreme for the districts that they actually represent. And then secondly, make sure that we let the Republicans know that we expect them to stand firmly and united against these massive spending bills. So far, to their credit, they have done that, and that's a good thing. However, Republicans, we've seen them wander far off the reservation in recent years and decades on government spending. In fact, I think it's the greatest failure of Republicans in Washington in the last 20 years has been on federal spending and state spending to a lesser extent. So that's the effort we have at AFP. I'm on the road nonstop. I was in Des Moines, Iowa, and Iowa 3 with our team there, All Red in Texas, the All Red district in Dallas, Texas before that, across this country. And I believe there's, Jesse, the beginning of a grassroots revolt against all this spending we're seeing in Washington. We've just got to fan those flames. Do it civilly, do it respectfully, but do it with all our hearts because it's a big moment for the country.
No, that's absolutely right. And one of the things I'd really like to touch on here is that when you talk about all the spending, we hear about, well, we want to build roads, we want to build bridges, we want to, help businesses. But that always seems to be an extremely small part of what they're actually proposing. What are some of the other things that they're not really telling us about in a lot of these discussions and this legislation that they're proposing?
Well, yeah, I put air quotes around the word infrastructure
Yeah.
because there is more money in this $2.3 trillion tax and spend bill to buy electric cars and buses than there is for all of the roads and bridges and rail in that piece of legislation. I mean, Jesse, think about that for a minute. I'm not against electric cars. I want whatever the market wants, whatever Americans and consumers around the world are willing to buy. But this is government for ideological reasons deciding, hey, you know what? We're going to use the power of government to force Americans to choose electric cars and buses. And that's wrong. And also, it doesn't cars more efficient. When you guarantee market share to any product, they don't need to innovate. They don't need to get better. So in the end, it actually hurts them as far as getting better products because when you guarantee market share to anything, whether it's electric cars or wind or solar, then they don't have to keep innovating and getting better and being more competitive and less expensive because they have guaranteed market share. Duh. That's a terrible idea. This next spending bill they're talking about is the universal pre-K or pre-kindergarten free. And again, the word free, it's not free. Someone's paying for it. Actually,
No
we're
one's paying.
stacking up more in debt. Free community college for everyone. And that's so far afield from infrastructure. Healthcare costs are in this bill by the billions and billions. That's not infrastructure. Healthcare is important, absolutely. mean, my mom's 85. She's on Medicaid or Medicare. I want to make sure that's protected. It is, by the way, but that's not infrastructure. And so this spending spree is outrageous coming out of Washington. Sadly, and I say the word sadly for a second time because it is, but sadly, last year, Republicans in those last couple of bills, when they had slim majorities, they spent too much as well. However, what the Democrats are proposing now is even more, even further, even more extreme than we've ever seen.
And that's the thing is that I think there's certainly those on both sides of the aisle who like to point out when the other side, their spending is justified morally superior to the other side's deficit spending. And I think one of the things I appreciate the most about America's prosperity is that we hold both parties accountable. We don't pick and choose which deficits are okay and which ones are not. We hold both parties to the same standard of we must maintain, fiscal concern, and we can't continue this deficit spending. What do you hear when you're out in the States? And I know you spend a lot of time traveling the States. What are you hearing from people what is their perception? What's going on in Washington?
I think a lot of the broader activist base, frankly, is distracted because I don't know if folks watching feel this way, but sometimes there's so much coming at you, it feels overwhelming, right? And sometimes you think, well, what can I do about all this? What is it that I can actually impact? And that happens to us. And sometimes we become grievance focused. And when you're grievance focused about something, you turn inward, you become frustrated and sometimes bitter, and you're not able to reach out and persuade and win over and bring people to our cause, to our values. That's why it's so important, instead of being grievance based as a movement, that we're actually policy based, that we're actually focused on the policies and the values. Because when you're focused on policies and values, you're better able to turn outward and win people over in a convincing, compelling way that brings them to you. And so that is one concern I have about our movement right now. I am seeing the reemergence of more of a focus on policy. And I tell folks out on the road, if you really want to be able to make a difference on something, take this current tax and spending bill. Pick up the phone, use social media, use your text or email, contact directly your House member, your two senators, tell them you expect them to vote no. That's taking constructive action. Use your social media networks, your community outreach, and your bonds to tell people about why this spending and taxation is hurtful for them, their families, the people they love, and our country. That's a policy-based way. That's a constructive way to make a difference for freedom and prosperity and for this country again. Yes, there are grievances, and they're frustrating as all get out. But when you focus on the policies, it gives you an ability to make a difference in a way that brings people to us and our values rather than turns inward and frankly loses people. That's the biggest thing that I'm seeing. I'm starting to see that, Jesse, happening out on the road. More of our movement is getting dialed into these issues where we can make a difference. And I know sometimes people say, oh, well, gosh, I know how my member is going to vote. They're already with us. They're one of the good guys. Good guys need to hear from you. They need to be encouraged. I was in Nashville, Tennessee 2 nights ago with one of the good guys, Congressman Mark Green from Tennessee. And we had a big crowd of activists. And he looked out over that crowd and he said, wow, I haven't seen this many freedom fighters together on an issue in a long time. This is encouraging. You want to buck up. Have the support of the guys who are doing the right thing and the gals. And then those who are on the other side, they still want to get reelected. They always do. And when they see their districts and their states pouring in calls and emails and social media messages and coming out to rallies on the other side of an issue from them, I'm telling you, Jesse, it makes a difference. They may not want to change their vote, but they want to preserve their political careers, their futures. That's what they'll do.
A wise man once said that elected officials' number one job is to get reelected. Yeah. And there's plenty that feel that way. And when I think people sometimes underestimate the power of picking up the phone, calling, calling your elected officials. I mean, as you just said, the time that you spend with a lot of these folks across the nation, their offices feel that it has an impact that encourages them to
To
do the
your
right
point,
things.
yeah, to your point, you and I have both worked with members of Congress and members of the state legislature for many, many years. I'm older than you, so me more, but both of us a long time.
Yeah.
And I know, and we know that every House member, every Senate member, they pull their phone out today and they look at how many contacts they've had from their district or their state in the last 24 hours, the last 48 hours, on what issues, and then whether people are for them or against them, and what's the count or what's the percentage. They track it relentlessly. It
Yep.
does make a difference. And so I would urge folks, use our I volunteer effort at Americans for Prosperity, or your own, or whatever group out there provides that for you, or just do it yourself. But I'm telling you, it's a great way to make your voice known. And then use social media, your own community networks at church or synagogue or PTA or Little League Baseball, all out there to proselytize, to spread this
Yep.
message. And I'm telling you, the last thing I'll say here, honey gets more than vinegar. Win people over with kindness and love. Yes, righteous indignation does have a place. Absolutely. But it cannot be our only position. It cannot be our default position. We've got to show joy. People want to be part of something that's joyful. It needs to be genuine, but joy and hope and opportunity. That also brings people in along with the righteous indignation.
No, and that's 100% correct. And I think one of the things that I like that we do as an organization is help people tell their story in a way that connects. It's compassionate, but it tells a real impact with bad policies like this. And Tim, I think you can speak to the fact of what happens if we stay on this course nationally and we just keep printing more money and borrowing more money. What's the impact going to be on people?
We're already seeing it in the short term. Inflation is through the roof. Folks watching saw the numbers on inflation last month and the month before that. It's ruinous, or it's going to be ruinous. And this isn't just in one area. It's not a bubble, an inflationary bubble in one area. It's almost across the board. Commodities, big ticket items in the product list, cars, trucks, houses, etc. Small ticket items, the price of lumber, 2x4s, for example. We're already seeing that. Who does inflation hurt the most? Not the elites. It hurts the little guy and the little person the most. That's who it hurts the most. That's happening already. Then we are already seeing the dissipation of job creation. Last month's job numbers missed the projections by almost 750,000 jobs. The month before that, March, were revised downward over 100,000 jobs as well. So job creation not happening, inflation through the roof. Those are the first two tremors that we're seeing in this economy. Long term, nothing less than our prosperity is at stake. When interest rates go up, and at some point, even if the Federal Reserve tries to artificially hold them down, the market will frankly just step in and the rates will go up. When the rates go up to 3, 4, 5, 6% higher than where they are right now with the Fed, we're going to see that the servicing of this national debt we have, that $30 trillion, it's going to eat up a quarter of our federal budget, a third of our federal budget. And then within a few years, it'll be at half. Think about that. A $4 trillion budget, a $3.5 trillion budget at the federal level, and half of that, or 40% of that, is gone to servicing the debt. Your country's not going to remain prosperous at that point. And so the stakes are enormous in the near term, but the long-term prosperity of this country, it's absolutely at stake.
Yeah, and the Western Conservative Summit hosts people from all across the nation, predominantly in the Mountain West. Who are some targets that you can think of right now that they should reach out to and start really having these conversations with their office about the concern about the spending and the waste in Washington?
Well, I think about both the spending and also the filibuster issue in the United States Senate. And the West has some of the key senators on that effort as well in preserving the rights of the minority and this way of a more restrained federal government by having a filibuster in place in the United States Senate. The key senators in that, Democrat Cortez Masto in Nevada, both Democrat senators in Arizona, Kelly and Senator Jon Tester in Montana. Those are 4 of the most important U.S. senators that we need to make sure we're messaging to tell them, hey, keep your word, protect the filibuster, preserve the filibuster, that actually will stave off a lot of this extreme policy, Jesse, that you and I have been talking about. Then there are a host of House members across the West. I mentioned I was in Des Moines, Iowa, Iowa 3, Cindy Axne. I was in Kirkpatrick's district in Arizona, Nevada 3, Nevada 2, right there in those greater Las Vegas suburbs are crucial as well. In Colorado, I think about the House districts that are in swing areas that are held by Democrats, but they're not acting like moderate swing politicians ought to be when they're in one of these swing districts. And there are some Republicans that need to have their spines stiffened as well to make sure that they keep doing the right thing. It's early. They can wander off the reservation. And frankly, one worry I have is that Joe Biden will step up and say, let's do a bipartisan, I use those words in air quotes too, a bipartisan spending bill next. We're not going to spend 2.3 trillion. We'll only spend, $1.2 trillion or $1.3 trillion. I worry that you could have a Senator Mitt Romney or a Senator Lisa Murkowski or some other Republicans join what would supposedly be a skinny spending and tax bill. What a terrible idea for the country. They've already spent too much. They just spent 1.9 trillion more only a few weeks ago in that first big spending bill. There shouldn't be another big spending bill under the auspices of partisanship or bipartisanship, excuse me. So there are a lot of key folks out in the West. You know this, Jesse. We've talked about it. Along with Florida, the fastest growing region of the country is the Wild Wild West. No question about it. I think about Colorado gaining a House seat, Arizona gaining a House seat, Nevada booming, Idaho is booming. I was just with the governor of Idaho. That state is booming in growth. Montana just got a new congressional district because it's growing so fast. Texas is getting, I think, 2 districts, or at least 1. I think 2 though. Districts as well. The Wild Wild West, along with Florida, you're the fastest growing region of the country. What happens there, I believe, is frankly the direction of the country writ large in the next 2 decades.
No, that's absolutely correct. Especially with our population increases from California, New York, and Illinois. We definitely, me and my fellow colleagues in those other states certainly have our hands full. So, well, Tim, I appreciate you taking some time with us today and sharing this important message. We're encouraging everybody to go to stopthespendingspree.com and make your voice heard immediately and help us fight back against these issues. Thanks again for your time, Tim.
Thanks.
We're now joined by our Vice President of Economic Opportunity and America's Prosperity, Akash. Akash, why don't you introduce yourself and tell the people a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Jesse. Great to be here. Akash Chogli. So I'm the Vice President of Economic Opportunity at the Stand Together Chamber of Commerce, which is the network that Americans for Prosperity is part of. Prior to this role, I was on Capitol Hill for 2 years with the House Education and Labor Committee doing labor relations, wage and hour policy for the House Republicans. Prior to that, I was at Americans for Prosperity as the Director of Policy. So I've spent a lot of time working on state and federal policy, have some Colorado connections as well. So always great to join this crowd and looking forward to diving in.
Right. So let's jump right in. I mean, Congress, the ink barely dried on the signature for a near $2 trillion deal that Washington did. And now we hear them talking about another $4 trillion in spending. So I think it's important for people to understand how much of this proposal goes to infrastructure versus how much goes to other wasteful spending projects.
Yeah, I think that's a really core question. And, people love the idea when they hear infrastructure, they don't like the roads and bridges in their own community. A very, very charitable interpretation of what they have rolled out is between 1/3 or even 2/3 of this is infrastructure. I think that's way overblown. If we're talking just roads and bridges, Jesse, the stuff that regular folks use every day to drive to work, bring their kids to school, we're talking about less than 5% of this multi-trillion-dollar bill. And here's the thing, that's nothing new. They did the exact same thing on the COVID bill. Less than 7% of that COVID relief bill was actually COVID relief. And so this is a partisan bait and switch to advance long-held political priorities, and it's something that conservatives have to be aware of so they don't fall for it.
What would you consider some of the more atrocious things that are in this legislation?
Yeah, I mean, there are things, like I said, that have absolutely nothing to do, A, with COVID relief, getting the economy going again, fixing our roads. It's just long held political priorities. I'll give you an example. Some folks in the audience might have heard of the Protecting the Right to Organize Act. That's a bill that would upend more than 70 years of established labor law, private sector, federal law that governs how we form unions and how workers are represented in the private sector. Absolutely nothing to do with infrastructure, absolutely nothing to do with getting the economy going again. Would do the exact opposite, right? Tilt the playing field in favor of organized labor, make it easier to force tens of millions of workers into unions who have no business being in one and don't want to be with one. But if they can jam that in this partisan bill, they're 100% planning to do so. And so that's just an example of how far out to left field this package really is.
Yeah, and I think you said when people hear about this infrastructure bill, they're focused on the roads and bridges, which we know is about 5% of this legislation. As an organization, what would we want to see in an infrastructure bill if we had the ability to craft one and say, hey, this is what it should look like? What would we offer?
Yeah, I think the first core component is how much of this doesn't need to be at the federal level. The vast majority of infrastructure spending and investment in this country is done by states and is done by the private sector. And there's a reason for that, right? They are closer to the actual issues on the ground. The state of Colorado, the folks that live out there, work in state government, local government, the private sector, they know what needs to be addressed, what the needs are, what the solutions are. Obviously, the landscape is very unique out west. These are problems that the federal government and bureaucrats sitting in Washington, D.C. will never properly address. So I think that's the first principle. The next is there is a ton of waste and diversions and unrelated spending already baked into our transportation infrastructure spending and programs. The gas tax is meant to function as a user fee, which is a great idea, right? We use the roads, we should pay to fix them and upkeep. But gas tax funds are diverted to mass transit, they're diverted to bike trails, it's diverted to flower beds. I mean, we talk about Davis-Bacon wage mandates that's funneling money towards union dues instead of roads and bridges and concrete and asphalt. So there's a number of changes that could be made within the existing infrastructure package, within the existing scheme of infrastructure spending that we have in this country before we have any conversation about another 800 billion or $1 trillion that we need to spend and borrow to pay for more.
Yeah, and I think audience members some of this will sound familiar with what happened in Colorado with Senate Bill 260, their transportation legislation that was talking about building roads and bridges, and it was all these other things. And what they were not talking about is a small portion of it goes to roads and bridges, allegedly. And we'll find out. But at the end of the day, what the other parts of the bill does is create massive mass transit. It wants to build EV infrastructure. So wealthier communities who use EVs will have more infrastructure to charge their cars, funded by low-income communities across Colorado who are using the bus. And I mean, it's a wildly unfair structure, but much like we see in Washington, it's they're selling one thing, that the proposal is about this, when in fact the vast majority is about something totally different, and that's really unfortunate.
No, that's exactly right. And I think the reason they're able to do this is because they're counting on people either, frankly, believing what they're being told from Washington, or frankly, Jesse, not paying attention, right? There are a lot of issues animating folks, particularly conservatives have a lot to be concerned about these days. This is something that people have to pay attention to, because if you don't, and you kind of fall for just the idea that government needs to spend more money to fix our roads, and there's, a lot of other issues that, like I said, are animating people. They'll slide this thing right through on partisan majorities and spend trillions more borrowing from China, printing money, driving up inflation, and whatever else.
Yeah, and that's something I want to get into here in a little bit. But and I think your point there is so important in that, I always tell people you have to read more than the bill title, right? Like, bill titles are one thing, especially in Washington, because they can cram anything they want. In Colorado, we have single subject. It's not as good as it used to be. Another bipartisan piece of legislation that blew a hole in that. But it's really important to understand everything that's in these bills. And people are busy. And I mean, that's something that we in Americans Prosperity do, is to try to bring those issues forward, educate people on that, and say, hey, this is what you read, but this is actually what's in the bill. One thing that I want to dive into a little bit, here in Colorado, and certainly in a lot of the Western states, is we rely heavily on energy. And I know there's there's some energy and regulatory aspects of this bill that I'd like for you to explain to the audience.
Yeah, so just to be clear, there is no actual bill text yet. A lot of this is still up for debate. And frankly, Jesse, it's still up for debate even among Democrats, right? And I think one of the major reasons they are having a hard time coming to consensus are issues like energy, right? I mean, you talk about Democratic senators in Western states, Senator Sinema and Kelly, you know, in Colorado, Montana, they know how much the energy industry means to their states. And so you've got competition between kind of the radical far left, who wants to functionally regulate sort of fossil fuels, existing forms of energy out of existence, and subsidize green energy, clean energy, subsidize, you know, obviously political allies. And so there are a variety of ways they're looking at doing this, right? There are different tax schemes, regulatory schemes, like I said, subsidizing green energy and clean energy and other things over sort of existing, more traditional, more abundant and affordable forms of energy. And so there are very little specifics right now about what we're looking at. But it should be very, very clear, an explicit goal. They have said as much of the far left that's sort of driving the emphasis behind this bill is to functionally regulate existing affordable energy options out of existence to make room for green energy. As you mentioned, that will be disproportionately harmful to Western states, energy heavy states, not just when we're talking about energy costs, you know, driving to work, taking your kids to school, but jobs, Jesse. There are tens of thousands of jobs in states like Colorado, Texas. You know, we're talking about West Virginia, all over the country. That states like Colorado stand to lose if this thing goes through. And so that's something that folks, even though they might not hear about it, need to be aware of, need to be cognizant of, and need to be really active about reaching out to their lawmakers to let them know that they don't want to see it.
Yeah, and in Colorado, we've seen that all too much. We've seen massive efforts by the legislature and a lot of special interest groups to regulate the energy industry out of the state, and then suddenly they'll come back and say, or, you know, our budget's taking a hit. It's like, well, yeah, that's what happens is when you push thousands of jobs out and you tax to regulate an industry, you know, to the point where it's hard to operate. So, and to do this on a federal level is even more devastating. So that's definitely something that we need to be watching. One of the things that I know President Biden has been talking about is the proposed 28% corporate tax on businesses. So, and I know people hear this and they think to themselves, they think of these wealthy, large corporations that are going to, you know, like, oh, they can afford this, they can afford this. Can you help explain what that actually means to businesses across the nation?
Yeah, so this is another proposal that there are even a couple moderate Democrats who are saying, I mean, this is crazy, right? The reason that we brought the corporate tax rate down under President Trump was to be globally competitive. And of all people, President Obama even understood this. He tried to strike a deal. That deal fell through, but he was completely open to bringing down the corporate tax rate because folks know that we're in an increasingly globalized economy. We're competing against China, competing against countries in Europe and Asia, all over the world. We can't be taxing companies at rates pushing 40, 50%, which is obviously not the case in Colorado. But when you're talking about California, New York, where some of the most innovative, most powerful companies in the world are headquartered, I mean, we're really pushing 45, 50% corporate tax rate when you pile state rates on top of that. And here's the thing, Jesse, this is really, really important for conservatives to be able to understand. The corporate tax is not paid for by corporate CEOs. There are basically three things that pay for the corporate tax. That's either paid for in the form of lower returns for investors, higher prices for consumers, or lower wages for workers. Those three things, and you can divide those up any which way. The Congressional Budget Office estimates, frankly, that as much as 70% of the burden of corporate taxes is borne by workers in the form of lower wages. And so when we raise the corporate tax rate, what that means is lower return on investment, which means less investment, which means lower productivity of companies, and higher productivity is how we raise wages, and it's how we create the demand for more jobs. And so a higher corporate tax rate does mean fewer jobs and lower wages because it means less corporate investment, less corporate productivity. So that's what we're grappling with here at the federal level. It's something that, frankly, a lot of folks on the left just don't get or they refuse to acknowledge, which, again, it's really, really important for folks to speak out and explain to their friends and neighbors and lawmakers that they understand this concept and they don't want to see the corporate tax rate go up.
And that's just one of the several tax increases I know is being talked about. From day one after the Trump tax cut was put in place, they said we want to repeal the tax cut, which is code for tax increase. And what tax increases are being talked about beyond this?
Yeah, so there's a couple of really important ones I want to highlight, Jesse. So there are three that I think are really worth knowing. So there's tax increases on the individual side. There's a capital gains tax increase, and then there's taxes on inheritance that they're throwing around. So when we talk about individual income tax increases, they'll say, this is only a tax on the rich, the 0.001% or whoever we're talking about. There are not only wealthy individuals and wealthy families that pay the individual income tax. There are a lot of what's called pass-through businesses, which are businesses large and small, and a heck of a lot of small businesses stand to be crushed by raising the individual income tax top rate. These are, again, folks operating on pretty thin margins. They employ just a couple workers, and an increase in the top marginal individual income tax could put hundreds or even thousands of small businesses out of business as they're attempting to recover from the pandemic. The second one, right? We talked about capital gains taxes. These are basically double taxation, right? Those profits are taxed once, as corporate profits under the corporate tax rate. They're taxed again when they're reinvested in the form of a capital gains tax. We should be doing everything we can right now to encourage more private sector investment, right? We've seen hundreds and thousands of businesses close last year because of the pandemic. We need as much private sector investment as we can get to help people get back to work, provide job opportunities, get innovation going again in the private sector. This is the last thing we should be doing. And then the very last piece, when I talk about inheritance taxes, the reason this is really, really important for Western states, Jesse, is because it has a huge impact when we think of family farms, family businesses, right?
Yep, that's exactly it.
One of the things they want to do, and there's, again, a number of proposals being thrown around, when you pass down an asset, if you pass away to your next generation, they inherit that asset, and then they're only taxed on the gains in value from the point at which they inherit going forward. What that's called is called step-up basis, right? So if you pass it on to your kids, they inherit the value at the point at which they inherit it. They're taxed from that point forward. They want to eliminate that provision so that they would be taxed on all the gains made over your lifetime. When they didn't even own the asset, when they didn't even own the family farm, they would be taxed on those gains immediately upon inheriting, a family farm or family business, which again would impose a huge tax increase on young people, younger families, inheriting businesses, estates, family farms. And so it's a money grab to pay for a partisan bait and switch. And frankly, Jesse, none of these taxes would come even close to paying for the whole package, which is worth knowing, right? And that's when we get into borrowing and printing more money and all the other problems. So there really is quite a bit here that's worth paying attention to.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue into what I really want to talk about, because I feel like people are finally starting to wake up to something is wrong in Washington with the way they spend. And I've noticed more people who are, pretty apolitical who have been saying, "Hey, how are we going to pay for all this?" And I say, "What? That's a great question. What are the impacts over time as we keep printing money, we keep borrowing, we keep spending, we keep giving stimuluses, we keep doing all these things? What's the long-term ramifications that we're looking at right now?"
Yeah, I mean, there's basically two that I would highlight, right? Well, three. So when we talk about tax increases, right, we know tax increases are harmful for the economy.
Mm-hmm.
There is a finite amount of money, finite amount of resources in the economy. The more of that is spent by government in an unproductive manner, right? Government will never be an efficient allocator of resources and investment. It crowds out the amount of money and resources that is available for the private sector, which means less productive investment, less productive growth, less economic growth. Less economic growth obviously means fewer jobs and lower wages. So those are two really sort of upfront impacts. The third you talked about is what happens when we're printing and borrowing money, right? China holds more than $1 trillion of US debt. China is obviously a trading partner. It's a global competitor. It's somebody that we don't want to be beholden to, but we're making ourselves increasingly beholden to China when it comes to borrowing money. And so that's something to be aware of. And the last thing you mentioned is printing money, right? You hear a lot of folks say, well, just hit the printing press. Let's roll out some more cash into the economy. That's how inflation happens, right? If your wages aren't going up, but the dollar value is shrinking and the cost of goods is going up, your cost of living increases, your quality of life decreases, right? We get more money into the economy, prices go up, but your ability to pay those higher prices hasn't changed. that's basically sort of an unseen tax on the middle class, an unseen tax on the poor, all of which could result from ramming through more of these multi-trillion-dollar partisan bills that the Biden administration and congressional Democrats want to do.
Yeah, and I feel like people are actually seeing it and starting to feel it. I mean, they're seeing the cost of everything seems to go up. Everyone's complaining about gas prices. The cost of living is going up. Everything's going up. And I try to remind folks that the more we continue down this path, the more we're going to see this, and the more extreme it's going to be over time. Because at a certain point, we have to pay that money back. And I know there's people on both sides of the aisle who say deficits don't matter, but I think as a student of history, I know that's not true. And I know many in this room know that's not true. So what are some things that AFP has been doing over the last couple of years? Because I hear people say, oh, gosh, you only care about deficits when, Democrats are in charge. And I say, that's not true. Actually, we're consistent. We consistently have talked about this. We don't pick and choose, whose deficits we like better. What are some things that AFP has been doing over the years on this?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, and go even past the last couple of years. I mean, Americans for Prosperity started during the Bush administration, right? The Bush administration was not great on spending. Obviously, there was a lot of energy behind the Tea Party under President Obama that Americans for Prosperity was giving activists a voice to speak out against the Affordable Care Act and reckless spending under the Obama administration. Same thing under President Trump, right? He cut taxes and reformed regulations, reduced regulations, but that administration was not great about federal spending, and we said so. We're doing the same thing here. And what we have tried to do, one of the things we've tried to do is make sure that conservatives and all Americans are aware of this, right? We talked about the number of other issues that are animating people that you're hearing about on television and talk radio. This is one that hasn't gone away. It's only getting worse, and it's one that folks need to pay attention to. And so just last week, we launched a major nationwide effort with hundreds of events in key congressional districts, key states, to give people an outlet to make their voice heard. Let their lawmakers know, let their members of Congress know, their senators know that they don't want to see more of these multi-trillion-dollar bait and switch partisan boondoggles. And so we're out there running ads, knocking on doors, sending mail, organizing events, contacting lawmakers, and educating folks about what's going on. And we're a grassroots activist, volunteer-driven organization. We need all the help we can get because as folks in this room are aware, the media narrative and what sort of average folks who are disconnected from politics are hearing is not always the full story. So that's what we're out there trying to tell them.
No, that's right. And I think you nailed it right there. And what we can do today is you can go to stopthespendingspree.com. That's stopthespendingspree.com and make your voice heard. And let's hold both parties accountable and continue to keep driving this narrative of, we have to rein in this waste. We cannot continue this spending. So, Kosh, I really appreciate you making time with us today, and keep up all the great work that you're doing.
Thank you. Likewise, Jesse. Good to be with you.